The True Story of the Wilmington Ten by Larry Thomas. About the author, Larry Rennie Thomas, a native black Wilmington, is a writer based in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. He wrote this book as a thesis while he was an American history graduate student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is presently writing a novel about the Wilmington 10 incident, Rabbit, Rabbit, Rabbit. Introduction. In 1660, after a series of conflicts with the local Indians, a party of New England cattlemen finally abandoned their Carolina colony near the mouth of the 200-mile-long Cape Fear River. Their retreat was nearly a double disaster because not only did they have to leave behind most of their livestock, but they almost capsized near the treacherous Cape Fear. Luckily, almost at the last minute, their navigators steered their tiny ship into the Atlantic Ocean toward New England. Thus, their episode served as a warning to future Cape Fear settlers. Beware of the shifting sand dunes and the local redskins. Months afterwards, a group of armed, experienced explorers weaved their way through the Cape and made camp near the original settlement. On December 1st, 1663, Waukusa, the king of the Indians of the lower Cape Fear country, convinced that his fishermen's weapons were useless against gunpowder, made peace with the Englishmen. The Indian chief sold them the river and contiguous islands, presumably for some trinkets, which won his admiration. He also presented the group's leader with two of his handsome daughters, for whom the explorer promised to return in a day or two. But he sailed for the return trip to Barbados without fulfilling his promise. 6 months later, nearly 800 colonists arrived from Barbados to establish Charlestown. After 7 hard years, most of them sailed southward, where they later founded a new Charleston. In 1732, over half a century after their departure, the descendants of the remaining colonists and their new neighbors, the Scottish Highlanders, founded Newtown or Newton. There was an excellent harbor at Newton and good landing places for vessels, and it was easily accessible to traders from plantations. In 1739, Newton, by then the royal colony's largest town, became Wilmington, in honor of Spencer Compton, Earl of Wilmington. 2 years later, the prosperous port played host to a series of provincial assembly meetings. Thus, during the colonial period, Wilmington thrived. Yet it remained, like most of the Carolinas, almost totally isolated and equally as dependent on English commerce. In the early 18th century, Wilmington, population about 2,000, was divided into 4 groups. First of all, there was a small number of English planters who lived across the river on large rice plantations. Then, there was the most populous group, the Scotch-Irish middle class, who were the small farmers, merchants, and dock workers of the community. Thirdly, there was a small yet expanding group of African slaves who worked on the plantations and the docks. Lastly, there was the second largest group, the poor Anglo-European farmers of the pine forests, who sold naval stores for a living. The English planters controlled the economic, political, and social aspects of the community. Their forefathers were among the original Cape Fear pioneers who made peace with the local Indians. Their ancestors were also the ones who stayed in 1671 after most of the others went south. But most importantly, the English controlled Wilmington because they held the British trade connection, and all 4 parties knew that without it there would be no peace or prosperity. In the early 19th century, Wilmington, by then the port city of the state of North Carolina, was an integral part of the British transatlantic slave trade. Gradually, as more and more African slaves were imported, most of the local whites, aware of how isolated and hard to reach their peninsula was, developed extreme negrophobia. Consequently, because whites ultimately turned their fears into violence, the local blacks were terrorized, maimed, or killed whenever they got out of their places. At that time, the rich and middle classes generally left the job of suppressing blacks to the poor whites because they seemed to hate Negroes with a passion. Thus, the caste was set during slavery, and in the years that followed, Wilmington would experience numerous incidents of racial violence in which the 4 groups would assume the same roles time and time again. The following is a study of racial violence in Wilmington, North Carolina before February 1st, 1971. It begins with a short discussion of the city's racial violence prior to the Wilmington's race riot of November 10, 1989. This is followed by an examination of that riot and an analysis of the psychological damage done to Wilmingtonians because of it. Next, there is a description of the Wilmington Martin Luther King Jr. riot of April 6 to 10, 1968, and a discussion of its results. Finally, the study ends with an account of the racial violence that followed the closing of the all-black Williston Senior High School on August 1, 1968, and a summary of the events that preceded the arrival of the civil rights leader Benjamin Franklin Chavez Jr. in the Park City on February 1, 1971. Thus, the study attempts to explain why racial tensions were high years before the Wilmington incident of February 2 to 11, 1971, commonly called the Wilmington 10 incident. The two preceding incidents and the closing of Williston played prominent roles in the development of an affair which left 2 persons dead, 6 injured, and over $500,000 worth of property damage. The 1971 incident is significant because it led to the arrest, trial, conviction, and incarceration of a group of young people who were later referred to internationally as the Wilmington 10. The group consisted of 9 black males and a white female. Their 1972 convictions for firebombing Mike's Grocery, a white-owned business, and hindering firemen from saving the store netted each of them one of the lengthiest terms in the entire state's judicial history. Benjamin Ben Chavez Jr., a 24-year-old Oxford, North Carolina native, was handed up to 34 years in prison. The other blacks, basically Wilmington High School students, were Connie Tyndall, 21 years old, 31 years, Martin Chili Patrick, 19 years old, 31 years, Wayne Moore, 19 years old, 29 years, Reginald Epps, 18 years old, 28 years, Jerry Jacobs, 19 years old, 29 years, James Bunn McCoy, 19 years old, 29 years, Willie Earl Vereen, 18 years old, 29 years, and William Joe Wright Jr., 19 years old, with 29 years. Ann Shepard, a white 35-year-old Vista worker, was convicted of being an accessory before the fact of arson and for conspiracy to assault emergency personnel. The Auburn, New York native was sentenced up to 15 years. This study, however, is not concerned with their 1972 convictions. There has already been massive news coverage given to the questionable judicial procedures used to jail the 10. The following shifts the emphasis to the Black Wilmington experience prior to February 1, 1971. After all, there was nothing unusual about the long sentences. Some Black Wilmingtonians have been receiving those for years. What was unprecedented was the nationwide media coverage that the incident received in 1971. Thus, this study looks at the factors that caused the incident and the effect Ben Chavez had on those factors. Ultimately, this study will address itself to 2 important questions. Why was Wilmington's racial violence more pronounced than the other locations visited by Chavez? And was Chavez merely a catalyst or an instigator for blacks to loot, firebomb, and snipe? Before these questions can be answered, a closer examination of Chavez's activities before he came to Wilmington is necessary. But most of all, a clearer understanding of what Black Wilmingtonians thought he represented once he began to express their frustrations is imperative. Chapter 1. Since its settlement as Newtown or Newton in 1732, Wilmington, North Carolina has experienced numerous incidents of racial violence. During slavery, months after the Nat Turner insurrection of 1831, local white authorities beheaded 5 black slaves because they were the suspected leaders of an aborted insurrection. Each head was hung at a highly visible location, including one later called Negro Head Point as a warning for future Nat Turners. 5 full-scale riots occurred in Wilmington during Reconstruction, resulting in numerous injuries and at least 2 deaths. During April 1868, patrolling bands of Negroes armed with fence rails stalked the city streets in search of Ku Klux Klans men, whom they accused of terrorizing their neighborhoods several nights before. Finally, 2 months later, the 5th riot occurred, prompted by the efforts of a black mob to set free city prisoners. In 1898, Wilmington witnessed a race riot which left 3 whites injured, 11 Negroes killed, and 25 wounded. It began when a mob of whites, led by a former Confederate colonel, invaded the black section of the city, set fires to buildings, killed and wounded many blacks, and chased hundreds out of town. The impetus was the city's integrated, 4 blacks and 6 whites, Republican Populist Board of Aldermen. Some local white Democratic Party members deemed it illegitimate and staged the riot to gain control of the city government. Their leader, Alfred Moore Waddell, stated, "We will not live under these intolerable conditions. No society can stand it. We intend to change it if we have to choke the current of the Cape Fear with Negro carcasses." From all indications, change his condition is what Waddell did. After the riot, he became the city's mayor. Most of his followers were adequately rewarded for their part also. There were approximately 400 of them, all whites, and more importantly, all members of the Democratic Party. By the 1890s, Republicans, black and white, were able to join hands with the newly conceived Populist Party and win elections. In fact, the state's governor and United States senator were both fusionists. John Hope Franklin has written, quote, "In 1894, such a combination seized control of the North Carolina legislature. Immediately, the Democratic machinery was dismantled and voting was made easier so that more Negroes could vote. Negro office holding soon became common in the eastern black belt of the state. The fusion legislature of 1895 named 300 Negro magistrates. Many counties had Negro deputy sheriffs. Wilmington had 14 Negro police, and New Bern had both Negro policemen and aldermen. One prominent Negro, James H. Young, was made chief fertilizer inspector and director of the state asylum for the blind, and another, John C. Dancy, was appointed collector of the port of Wilmington." End quote. By October 1897, the city of Wilmington, population 1890 census 10,089 whites and 13,937 blacks, was completely governed by fusionists. Mayor Silas P. Wright, a Republican, and his board of 4 black aldermen, i.e. Andrew J. Walker, Owen Fennell, Elijah M. Green, and John G. Norwood, and 6 white aldermen, i.e. W. E. Springer, W. E. Yop, B. F. Keith, A. J. Hewitt, D. J. Benson, and H. C. Twining, held office. Other black office holders included Charles Norwood, the New Hanover County Treasurer, Henry Hall, Assistant Sheriff, Dan Howard, City Jailer, John Taylor, Customs Bookkeeper, and David Jacobs, County Coroner. Wilmington's Democrats resented these 9 black office holders. They contended that the city's black population was becoming insolent and impudent. One Democrat wrote, quote, "Conditions in Wilmington were becoming unbearable. It had become most uncomfortable for white women and girls to appear on the streets, as some of them had been elbowed off the sidewalks by colored women. Many colored men were insolent because political developments had given them an erroneous idea of their position in public affairs. Their white leaders had misguided them while making out their own selfish ends." End quote. In January of 1898, the white Democrats prepared quietly but effectively to overthrow the fusion government. A group called the Secret Nine, Hugh McRae, J. Allen Taylor, Hardy L. Fenner, W. A. Johnson, L. B. Sasser, William Gilchrist, P. B. Manning, E. S. Lothrop, and Walter L. Parsley, met at the home of Hugh McRae to map strategy. The city was divided into sections, and men were placed in charge of each area. The whites also armed themselves with repeating shotguns, rifles, and pistols. I doubted if there was a community in the United States that had as many weapons per capita as here in Wilmington, boasted one member of the 9. The group, however, decided to adopt a wait-and-watch policy. They feared harsh reprisal from the local fusionist authorities, who they dubbed the Big Four, referring to Dr. Silas P. Wright, the mayor, G. Z. French, the former postmaster of Wilmington and acting sheriff of New Hanover County, W. H. Chadbourne, the postmaster, and F. W. Forrester. The 9 detested the 4 because they controlled the majority voters, the Negroes, who always voted the Republican ticket, as that was the political faith of their emancipator, Abraham Lincoln. This control of the Negro vote assured these Republican office holders a continuity in the office and local influence. The white Democrats were convinced that they had to recover their government for economic reasons, too. They had become frustrated with the number of blacks with higher-paying jobs. They agreed that this practice was retarding the city's growth. One local Democrat wrote, quote, "Negroes were given preference in the matter of employment, for most of the town's artisans were Negroes, and numerous white families in the city faced bitter want because their providers could get little work as brickmans, carpenters, mechanics, and this economic condition was aggravated considerably by the influx of many Negroes, and Wilmington was really becoming a mecca for Negroes and a city of lost opportunities for the working-class whites." End quote. Wilmington also had a substantial black business and professional community. The white Democrats complained of the stiff competition for black lawyers. Armand W. Scott, L.A. Henderson, William A. Moore, and L.P. White gave their white counterparts. The Democrats' primary objection, however, was more than for political or economic reasons. They were enraged by the social implications that the city government brought along with it. One white Democrat reported, quote, "The Negroes became more and more intoxicated in their newly acquired freedom. Instead of enjoying their rights privately, many of them insisted on publicly demonstrating their foolish belief that the uncultured African was the social equal to the cultured whites." End quote. One cultured and apparently educated African who infuriated them most of all was the local black newspaper editor, Alex L. Manley. The whites considered Manley a smart aleck, especially after he wrote an editorial first published on August 8, 1898, in response to Rebecca Latimer Felton's speech about the frequency of rape. The Atlanta Journal editorialist made the speech before the Georgia Agricultural Society at Tybee, Georgia, in 1896. Following is the most controversial part of the near-white Manley's editorial. Quote, "We suggest that the whites guard their women more closely, as Miss Felton says, thus giving no opportunity for the human fiend, be he white or black. You leave your goods out of doors and then complain because they are taken away. Poor white men are careless in the matter of protecting their women, especially on farms. They are careless of their conduct toward them, and our experience among poor white people in the country teaches us that the women of that race are not any more particular in the matter of clandestine meetings with colored men than are the white men with colored women. Meetings of this kind go on for some time until the woman's infatuation or the man's boldness bring attention to them, and the man is lynched for rape. Every Negro lynched is called a big, curly, black brute, when in fact many of those who have been thus dealt with had white men for their fathers, and not only were not black and burly, but were sufficiently attractive for white girls of culture and refinement to fall in love with them, as is well known to all." End quote. That editorial, declared one of the 9, is the straw that broke Mr. N-Word's political back in Southland. Indeed it did. The Democratic state press, specifically the Raleigh News and Observer, used it to provide whites with an excuse to fight against black and white fusionists. Democrats used Manley's editorial in a statewide campaign to expose the Wilmington city government. They were convinced that once Wilmington fell, then the whole state would. The 9 continued to hold their meetings. They planned for the riot to begin on November 10, 1898, 2 days after the statewide elections. Their meetings were quite secretive because they feared being arrested. The Monday night before Election Day, the Secret 9 initiated a mass meeting at the New Hanover County Courthouse. It was there that the group drew up the following Declaration of White Independence, as follows. Believing that the Constitution of the United States contemplated a government to be carried on by an enlightened people, believing that its framers did not anticipate the enfranchisement of an ignorant population of African origin, and believing that those men of the state of North Carolina who joined in forming the Union did not contemplate for their descendants subjection to an inferior race, we, the undersigned citizens of the city of Wilmington and the county of New Hanover, do hereby declare that we will no longer be ruled by men of African origin. This condition we have in part endured because we felt that the consequences of the War of Succession were such as to deprive us of fair consideration of many of our countrymen. We believe that, after more than 30 years, this is no longer the case. The stand we now pledge ourselves to is forced upon us suddenly by a crisis, and our eyes are opened to the fact that we must act or leave our descendants to a fate too gloomily to be borne. While we recognize the authority of the United States and will yield to it if exerted, we would not for a moment believe that it is the purpose of more than 60 million of our own race to subject us permanently to a fate which no Anglo-Saxon has ever been forced to submit. We therefore, believing that we represent unequivocally the sentiment of the white people of this county and city, hereby for ourselves, and as representing them proclaim, first, that the time has passed for the intelligent citizens of this community, owning 95% of the property and paying taxes in like proportion, to be ruled by Negroes. Second, that we will not tolerate the action of unscrupulous white men in affiliating with the Negroes, so that by means of their votes can they dominate the intelligent and thrifty element in the community, thus causing businesses to stagnate and progress to be out of the question. Third, that the Negro has demonstrated by antagonizing our interest in every way, and especially by his ballot, that he is incapable of realizing that his interests are and should be identical with those of the community. Fourth, that the progressive element in any community is the white population, and that the giving of nearly all the employment of Negro laborers has been against the best interests of this county and city, and it's sufficient reason why the city of Wilmington, with its natural advantages, has not become a city of at least 50,000 inhabitants. Fifth, that we propose in the future to give the white man a large part of the employment heretofore given to Negroes, because we realize that white families cannot thrive here unless there are more opportunities for the employment of the different numbers of said families. Sixth, that the white men expect to live in this community peacefully, to have and provide absolute protection for their families, who shall be safe from insult or injury from all persons whomsoever. We are prepared to treat the Negroes with justice and consideration in all matters which does not involve sacrifices of the interests of the intelligent and progressive portion of the community, but we are equally prepared now and immediately to enforce what we know to be our rights. Seventh, that we have been, in our desire for harmony and peace, blinded both to our best interest and our rights. A climax was reached when the Negro paper of the city published an article so vile and slanderous that it would, in most communities, have resulted in the lynching of the editor. We depreciate lynching, and yet there is no punishment provided by the courts adequate for this offense. We therefore owe it to the people of this community and of this city as a protection against such license in the future that the paper known as the Record cease to be published and the editor be banished from this community. We demand that he leave the city forever within 24 hours after the issuance of this proclamation. Second, that the printing press from which the Record has been issued be packaged and shipped from the city without delay, that we be notified within 12 hours of the acceptance or rejection of this demand. If the demand is agreed to within 12 hours, we counsel forbearance on the part of all white men. If the demand is refused, or if no answer is given within the time mentioned, then the editor, Manley, will be expelled by force. Immediately after the writing of the declaration, the Secret Nine, who by this time were surely not that secret, appointed a committee of 25 to make sure that the document's wishes were carried out. Colonel Alfred Moore Waddell, staunch Democrat and defeated office seeker, was made chairman and chief spokesman. Before the meeting adjourned, Waddell told the crowd, "Go to the polls tomorrow, and if you find the Negro out voting, tell him to leave the polls, and if he refuses, kill him. Shoot him down in his tracks." The Democrats were successful on Election Day, 1898. John D. Bellamy, nominee for Congress, George Rountree and Martin S. Willard, nominees for the legislature, and Walter G. McRae, sheriff candidate, were easily elected. Still, the victory meant very little to local politics. The integrated board of aldermen remained. New elections for them were not to be held until early 1899. Late Tuesday evening, the riot almost began prematurely. A band of 50 mounted whites formed and were en route to the Records office, Alex L. Manly's newspaper, to burn it down and lynch Manly when they were detoured by one of the 9, Hugh McRae, who convinced them to wait until after the mass meeting to be held the following morning. Shortly afterwards, the Committee of 25 held a meeting with the prominent black citizens of the community. They presented the group with the Declaration of White Independence and a list of their demands. John Dancy, a black, asked for permission to speak. He was told by Wedall that no black would be allowed to address the floor. It was a confused and terrified group of blacks who later met at Elijah Lane's barbershop. Those recorded as present were Dr. J. H. Alston, physician; Richard Ashe, financier; John H. Brown; John Carroll, caterer; John Goings, associated with the Manly Press; Elijah Green, alderman elected from the 5th Ward, 1897 to 98; H.C. Green, merchant; Henry Green, James Green, Josh Green, Colin wood dealer; L.A. Henderson, lawyer; Dan Howard, first jailer in New Hanover County; John Holloway, clerk in the post office; John H. Howe, contractor; John T. Howe, in the legislature of 1897 from New Hanover County; David Jacobs, coroner of the New Hanover County; David J. Jones, wheelwright; J.W. Lee, the Reverend; W.H. Leake, Methodist minister; Alex Mallet, Dr. T.R. Mask, physician; T.C. Miller, financier who made loans to whites and blacks; William A. Moore, lawyer; Carter Peaman, barber and politician; Brown Reardon, R.S. Pickens, magistrate; Isham Quick, a Colin wood dealer; Robert Reardon, Thomas Riviera, a mortician; Fred Sajwar, financier and architect; Armand Scott, lawyer; and the Reverend J.W. Telfair, manager of the James Sprent Cotton Press. The group drafted a reply, written by Attorney Scott, to the Committee of 25, but instead of delivering it personally, Scott decided to mail the letter. He later contended that it was unthinkable for any black to enter the white-populated district that night for fear of foul play. This is a reputed copy of the letter. Honorable A. M. Waddell, Chairman, Citizens Committee, Wilmington, North Carolina. Dear Sir, we, the colored citizens to whom was referred the matter of the expulsion from the community of the persons and press of A. M. Manly, beg, most respectfully, to say that we are in no way responsible for, nor in any way endorse, the obnoxious article that called forth your activities. Neither are we authorized to act for him in this manner, but, in the interest of peace, we will most willingly use our influence to have your wishes carried out. Very respectfully, the Committee of Colored Citizens. On November 9th, the day after the state election, Democratic Party morning papers carried announcements calling whites to a mass meeting at 11 o'clock that day. About 1,000 citizens gathered for a mass meeting at the courthouse. Chairman Alfred Moore Waddell read aloud the Declaration of White Independence to the delight of the crowd. That declaration, observed one participant, brought forth tremendous applause from the large gathering of white men at the mass meeting. The crowd cheered this distinguished, white-haired, and bearded Southern gentleman throughout the course of his address. The declaration was unanimously approved by the meeting, followed by a wonderful demonstration, the assemblage rising to its feet and cheering, "Right, right, right," and there were cries of "Fumigate the city with the record" and "Lynch Manly." In addition to the declaration, the group added 2 important resolutions directly related to the subsequent riot. One amendment was the following: It is the sense of this meeting that Mayor S.P. Wright and Chief of Police John R. Melton, having demonstrated their utter incapacity to give the city a decent government and keep order therein, their continuance in office being a constant menace to the peace and welfare of this community, they ought forthwith to resign. The other amendment demanded that Manly cease publishing his daily record and leave the city immediately. Manly, however, was way ahead of the group. He secretly left the city 2 days before, headed north. Thursday morning, as planned, the riot began. Colonel Waddell and his followers waited an extra 30 minutes for a reply of some sort from the black leaders. When there was none, the action started. At precisely 8 o'clock a.m., about 400 armed whites marched from the armory of the Wilmington Light Infantry on Market Street. They ended up on South 7th Street in front of the Records office. The group set the building afire and commenced to attack blacks at will. Within hours, the city resembled a battleground, with the group firing on mostly defenseless blacks. One black eyewitness recalled, "Firing began, and it seemed like a mighty battle in wartime. The shrieks of children, of mothers, of wives were heard, such as caused the blood of the most inhuman person to creep. Thousands of women, children, and men rushed to the swamps, and there lay upon the earth in the cold to freeze and starve. The woods were filled with colored people. The streets were dotted with their dead bodies. A white gentleman said that he saw 10 bodies lying in the undertaker's office at one time. Some of their bodies were left lying in the streets until they were picked up the next day. Some were found by the stench and miasma that came forth from their decaying bodies under their houses. Every colored man who passed through the streets had either to be guarded by one of the crowd or to have a paper pass giving him the right to pass. Violence continued all throughout the day, and sporadic fighting occurred the next day. The action came to an end through the superior firepower of the group. Besides, most of the blacks who fought back were slain almost instantly. The others hid like scared rabbits in the woods. The blacks were saved from total annihilation by the local militia, the Wilmington Light Infantry. This military unit, however, should not be thought of as a mediator. One WLI member later wrote, "We have not killed enough Negroes. 2 or 3 white men were wounded, and we have not gotten enough to make up for it." 2 days after the violence, the group's leaders took the final step of the coup d'etat. At 4 p.m., Waddell and his associates demanded that the Republican populist city government resign. Under the circumstances, Mayor Wright had no other option. One by one, he and his aldermen relinquished their offices to the Democrats. Waddell became mayor. H.P. West, B.F. King, A.B. Skelding, Charles W. Worth, William H. Sprunt, Preston L. Bridgers, and the Reverend J.W. Kramer became aldermen. Edgar G. Parmel was named chief of police, with M.F. Gouverneur as assistant and John F. Furlong as the captain of police. One of the first official acts of Mayor Waddell was to send search parties of kindly disposed white men into the woods to retrieve terrified blacks. In the woods, in the night, in the darkness of the pines, a child cried. A coarse voice crooned softly a mournful song. "When the battle's over, we can wear a crown, and New Jerusalem." The Wilmington race riot of November 10, 1898 was without question the most damaging affair, physically and psychologically, of the city's racial violence prior to the 20th century. Part of the statewide Democratic Party's campaign to disenfranchise black voters, it left a black intellectual and political vacuum because most black leaders fled the city, some never to return again. For example, attorney Armand Scott, who was given a free train ride out of town, later became a prominent judge in Washington, D.C. Most of the Committee of Colored Citizens also left Wilmington and prospered elsewhere. Thus, the riot's aftermath humiliated and degraded the local black elite and left the black community with no one of their own race to hold in high esteem. So, as time passed, the effects of the riot eventually reduced most of the local black mentality to where it was before the Civil War, to that of the docile, passive slave. Except this was worse, because back then, most black Wilmingtonians did not have anything to lose. The riot's instigators took almost everything they possessed. They robbed them of their political power, they destroyed their business community, they even erased their aspirations. Most importantly, the Democrats accomplished what they set out to do, to damage the blacks' self-respect and to keep them in their places. The most harmful result of the riot, however, was the mentality it gave some local whites. From that point on, they seemed convinced that violence was the best way to keep blacks at the bottom of the local political, economic, and social ladder. Thus, during the first half of the 20th century, Wilmington did not experience a serious racial confrontation because most local blacks, fearful of white retaliation, chose to remain out of the mainstream of the city's political, economic, and social life. Chapter 2. The 1950s, however, introduced a new period of racial activism to the port city. In 1958, a near riot occurred in the all-black Brooklyn section of the city after a mob attacked a white policeman whom they accused of physically abusing a black female during arrest. Police reinforcements were called in to quell the disturbance and to rescue the officer who was reportedly beaten up by the black female during the fracas. 10 years later, the second incident of that period, the Wilmington Martin Luther King Jr. riot of April 6 to 10, 1968, occurred as part of the nationwide black violent reaction to the assassination of the 39-year-old civil rights leader. Wilmington's violence was even more significant because the night Martin Luther King was killed, April 4th, he was supposed to be in the port city at the all-black Williston Senior High School speaking to a group of local blacks. Many black Wilmingtonians later insisted that if he had been there that night, he would be alive today. They adored King because he represented a morally and mentally flawless black man. They equated his appearance in Wilmington to that of a messiah who would erase the psychological scars caused by the Wilmington race riot of 1898. When he was destroyed, their hopes and aspirations were lost too. King's death was a double disaster for most black Wilmingtonians. However, because they not only considered themselves personally responsible, but because it also marked the second time in their history that they were robbed of strong black leadership. 2 days after his killing, some black Wilmingtonians followed violent examples set by thousands of American blacks. When the violence was over, Wilmington police reported 198 arrests, 21 injuries, and over $200,000 worth of property damage. Following is a narrative of that riot, which includes 1978 interviews with 4 of its participants. They are Brother G, a pseudonym, who was a 19-year-old unemployed male during the incident, Reverend Kojo Natambu, a.k.a. Roderick Kirby, who was a 16-year-old Hoggard High School student in 1968, Elijah Richardson, who was an 18-year-old Williston Senior High School student at the time, and Frank Funny One Hans, who was a 25-year-old unemployed male in 1968. Their accounts are important because they portray the frustrations and hopelessness experienced by most black Wilmingtonians after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4, 1968. The story begins with Brother G's reply to the question, "What were you arrested for?" in 1968. "For standing on a corner," he sarcastically replied. He went on to explain that the authorities charged him with inciting a riot and that he received 6 months' prison sentence. He also told me, the author, that he felt good participating in the riot. When I asked him why he was looting and firebombing white-owned businesses in his own neighborhood, Brother G replied, "Brothers said that they were seeking retaliation for King's death." This black retaliation, which occurred almost exactly 100 years after the Wilmington riot of April 1868, caught Wilmington authorities completely off guard. Late that Saturday night, April 6th, rampaging young Brooklyn blacks looted and damaged a liquor store on North 4th Street. "It started that Saturday," declared Reverend Kojo Natambo, who was 16 at the time. "They started tearing up white-owned stores, burning up the stores, looting them. Then they came down 4th Street and went from the north side to the south side. They went down Castle Street, tore it up." "How many?" "Many. There were so many brothers and sisters that if the police had known at the time and responded, they couldn't have done nothing with them. It looked like a tide of blackness, pouring down the street, man. This was the first time that I was truly inspired towards getting involved in the black struggle because I was with those people." Reverend Kojo Natambo is a minister of the locally organized First African Congregational of the BLACL, Messiah in Wilmington, North Carolina. He was a participant in both the Wilmington Martin Luther King Jr. riot of April 6 to 10, 1968, and the Wilmington incident of February 2 to 11, 1971. This community organizer had been involved in the black liberation struggle since his high school days at Hoggard High, 1967 to 70. He was one of the few black members of the first class to enroll at the suburban high school. In 1967, he was bused there from his Southside home New Jewelry housing projects. He remembered 1968 very well. Like I said earlier, man, in the 67, at both New Hanover, a predominantly white high school during that time, and Hoggard, most of the racial violence was confined to those schools. Then, in 1968, with the death of Martin Luther King, it hit the black community. That was the first time I had a chance to witness physical retaliation of blacks against whites. A close friend recommended that I interview Reverend Natambu because he is just like Malcolm X. 1 year after the Wilmington incident of February 1971, 20-year-old Roger Kirby became Kojo Natambu. It means one who controls his own destiny, he explained. Reverend Natambu was taught to be proud of his black skin at a very early age. He remembered growing up in a home with a framed picture of a black-skinned Jesus Christ in the living room. One pleasant May evening in 1978, he and his wife Linda invited me to their book-laden home. For over 4 hours, we taped his struggle to be a religious African in Wilmington, a city he readily equated with South Africa. He has not left Wilmington, except for a 2-year prison sentence for assault on a white policeman, for any length of time since he was born there in 1952. Would you call it, referencing WMLKR of 1968, a rebellion? Yeah, Natambu insisted. It was a rebellion in the sense that they felt it was an injustice that after 2 days, his killer had not been caught yet. What was the impetus for this violence? Was it because of what the others were doing nationwide? Well, we didn't know anything about what people were doing all over the nation, he replied, but we had a brother here who incited the brothers whose name was Monkey Ballard, who was exposed to community organizing and political understanding. No one seemed to know where Willie Monkey Ballard is living now. He left Wilmington permanently shortly after he and Frank Funny One Hans led the Wilmington Martin Luther King Jr. riot of April 1968. Harlem resident Frank Funny One Hans is also in exile from his native Wilmington. The 35-year-old social worker said he left Wilmington in 1969 primarily because he was job blacklisted by the local business community. He also contended that the local Ku Klux Klan threatened to take his life. Funny, as he prefers to be called, said these two factors caused him to seek safer pastures. The lanky former All-State Williston Senior High School and all-black high school basketball player freely admitted to leading, along with Willie Monkey Ballard, the WMLKR of 1968. On Palm Sunday, 1968, the crucial day of riot, Funny, Monkey Ballard, and Raymond King met with the Good Neighbor Council in an emergency session. The integrated group urged the trio to blunt the rioting. Hans said that the white men labeled the incident a riot. What would you call it? In one aspect, it was just a spontaneous act. In another, I guess we did it because we were really hurt. The older people didn't seem to really care about what was going on, he said. At one point, Hans continued, I thought they were afraid that they were going to lose their homes and money. But there are certain principles, man, no matter what you lose, you gotta go for it. And that's one of the main reasons I was out there. One middle-aged woman recalled hearing the running in the streets, but she dared not to go outside to investigate. Most black and white Wilmingtonians were shocked when the violence erupted on Saturday night. 2 days earlier, Police Chief Herbert Fats Williamson reported minor incidents of rock throwing and a firebombing shortly after King's death. But everything was under control, he stressed. Williamson also praised the local citizens for the coolness they displayed in the wake of the nationwide violence. But this coolness was short-lived. The morning following King's death, approximately 200 black students and adults from the all-black Williston Senior High School marched downtown for a short prayer service at the New Hanover County Courthouse on North Street between Princess and Market Streets. One former Williston student, 29-year-old Elijah Eli Richardson, remembered that peaceful march and the events that followed it. Now, on that Friday when we went to school, students were at a total unrest at 8:30 at the bell. Teachers were also thoroughly disgusted and did not care if you came to class or not. This was the first time that I had a high opinion of my black teachers, and I would like to praise Mrs. L.S. Williams as being a person that I would not have thought would have dismissed classes and said, "Let's go to the gymnasium and have a prayer." So all the classes started between 9 and 9:30, and we went to the gym and had a meeting and decided that the entire school would march downtown to the courthouse. Elijah Richardson was born and reared in the Brooklyn section of the Port City. There was evidence of poverty all around him: substandard housing, welfare mothers, unemployment, crime, and drugs. But he overcame those adversities, including a 2.5-year heroin possession prison sentence, to graduate from University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and become a drug counselor. Richardson also recalled that after the march, he and a group of Williston students forcibly lowered the American flag to half-mast at New Hanover High School. "We went over there and demanded that the flag be lowered to half-mast," he exclaimed. "At first, we had complications with the school's officials. They said, 'What are you doing here? You're trespassing.' But we were determined. We got some of the black New Hanover High students to see us. They saw what we were doing. Some of them left class. We felt good about getting the flag lowered. This was that Friday. Okay, that Friday evening, the violence got worse. There was probably full-fledged rioting about that time, as soon as night fell. Late that Friday night, around 11 p.m., Frank Funny One Hans, Willie Monkey Ballard, and approximately 100 blacks assembled at an open field near Gervais Housing Projects, 1 block from the busy intersection of South 8th and Dawson Streets. The group discussed what they should do about King's death. After much debate, they decided to march downtown. "What type of people were in this march, Funny?" "Blacks were young rebels," insisted Hans. "There were no middle class, elderly, or clergy involved. I was the leader. I led it all the way." Later, when I asked Funny did these young rebels seem to know why they were there, he replied negatively. "The ones that were 4 or 5 years younger than myself," Hans was 25 years old, "a lot of them were just there to say afterwards that they were part of it. They didn't really know why they were there. No direction whatsoever," he added. The group got as far as across the street from the New Hanover County Courthouse before they were stopped by a contingent of riot-equipped city policemen. At a police barricade in front of the courthouse, Monkey Ballard informed Assistant Chief J.O. Flowers that they intended to walk silently through the city. According to the local daily, the Wilmington Star-News, the group began chanting, we shall not be moved." Police officers asked the group to disperse and go home. The group sat down on the sidewalk and again began their chants. Ballard said, "We'll sit here all night if we have to." At this point, Ballard ordered silence and instructed the group to get information, which they did immediately. He urged them to stay together and to not break up. The group began chanting. Captain Flowers ordered the police to follow along the group to maintain order. Shortly after the group's departure, a heavy April shower interrupted their procession and caused most of them to seek shelter. Police cars then followed the dwindling crowd until the demonstration was over. Less than an hour after their confrontation with the black group, Wilmington police received reports of rock throwing at automobiles driven by whites near the 8th and Dawson area. At approximately 1:35 a.m., city firemen extinguished an arson attempt at the white-owned Gore's grocery store on the corner of South 10th and Dawson Streets. During the rainy night, the authorities also responded to calls of sporadic vandalism and false fire alarms in the black-populated North Side, Brooklyn, and South Side sections of the city. But these were minor compared to what might have developed. Thanks to the rainfall, Friday night was free of any major violence. Unfortunately, Mother Nature was not as kind the following night. Minutes after a Saturday night Brooklyn liquor store looting incident, Chief Williamson announced that the National Guard had been summoned to the city by Mayor O.O. Alsbrook. At 10:30 p.m., 2 National Guard platoons arrived at the police station on Red Cross Street between North Front and 2nd Streets. They divided into 3 groups with police and jeep escorts and marched down Harnett, Swan, and Nixon Streets to arrest as many young blacks as they could apprehend. Almost an hour later, police reported the firebombing and looting of the 3 white-owned Clardy's grocery stores. They were all total losses. At 11:20 p.m., Mayor Alsbrook placed the city under midnight curfew. The next day, Palm Sunday, was by far the worst day of the riot. At approximately 12:30 p.m., young blacks threw rocks, bottles, cinder blocks, bricks, and other debris at automobiles moving through Dawson and Castle Streets. 15 whites were injured, some seriously, as the thrown objects crashed through their windows. "Beat all I have ever seen," remarked an elderly female victim whose husband was knocked unconscious. Another injured male explained to the New Hanover Memorial Hospital's emergency room receptionist that he was assaulted by a hail of rocks and bricks as he stopped his car to let people through Castle Street. An unharmed female driver, whose passengers were not as fortunate, described a similar story. Nearly all of the victims were treated and released. A few required hospitalization. "In '68, man," said Brother G, "it broke out all of a sudden. All of the fellas came out. We wasn't bothering nobody, just hanging out on 8th and Dawson. It was a clear, sunny day. You could feel the tension. Somebody shouted, 'Something bad is gonna jump off. We can't go there.' The next thing I knew, brothers were throwing bricks through white-owned car windows. Bash, bash, bash. I saw one brother throw a brick into a white woman's face. She opened her door and fell in the street. She screamed, 'Oh my God, I can't see, I can't see.' They dragged her husband out of the car and robbed him. Weren't you afraid the authorities would drive through there?" "We were the authorities," he snapped. "We didn't care. We were going to the point of death. They thought we forgot about King. He was my idol. But the only thing I didn't like about him was nonviolence. You have to use violence when it is necessary." Minutes after the rock-throwing incidents, groups of young rioters roamed the streets. Many of them damaged and looted white-owned businesses on Castle and Dawson streets. Some sniped at and attacked police and guardsmen. Shortly afterwards, armored personnel carriers rolled into the riot area and sprayed tear gas. The National Guard come up in there with half-tracks, tanks. I threw a Molotov cocktail at one of them. They shot a tear gas canister at me, but they missed because I ran through my back door. The smoke came inside and caused my mama and everybody to run out the front door. "Why did you throw a Molotov cocktail at the tank?" "Because they were threatening my life, my family, my livelihood, my people," Brother G exclaimed. "The National Guard was the only thing that quelled it," he continued. "They had more firepower. At first, they sent in some racist cracker cops, but they had to get back." Laughter. "And we even had no guns. All we had was bricks." At about 1:30 p.m., the Good Neighbor Council, a local integrated group of civic leaders, met in an emergency session at City Hall with the three leaders of the riot: Funny One Hans, Monkey Ballard, and Raymond King. "That Sunday," Hans recalled, "the city sent some bourgeoisie blacks to the ghetto to find me. I don't know how they knew I was the leader, you understand, but they found me. They approached me and said that the mayor wanted to see me." Hans and his former Williston classmates welcomed the opportunity to talk to city officials. They accepted the mayor's invitation and accompanied a group of black council members downtown. At the beginning of the meeting, Marvin Johnson, the council's 35-year-old black chairman, urged the trio to help stop the violence. Mayor Alsbrook, state Good Neighbor official W.D. Bryant, the Reverend E.E. Curtin, local black physician, W.J. Wheeler, and others appealed to Ballard to reach the rioters so that the council could act on legitimate grievances. Ballard told the group that the slaying of King was the spark, not the reason for the trouble. The 25-year-old longshoreman hinted that an intensive city government shared part of the blame. He cited the lack of proper recreational facilities in the black communities as an example and emphasized that an explosive situation would remain until such problems were eliminated. However, he assured them their immediate goal was the same: no more violence. After an intense discussion, Ballard promised the group that they would go back to their neighborhood and try to restore order. But, he insisted, since most of the participants were children and young men, it would take time. The council warned him that time was of the essence, because the longer the disturbances lasted, the greater the chances were for riot retaliation. Near the end of the session, the council requested that the young men go back into their communities and compile a list of troubles and problems. Johnson told them, when this was completed, to contact him and he would call another Good Neighbor Council meeting. Mayor Alsbrook called the meeting great and announced, "We know each other better. There are no problems that we cannot solve by sincere and honest effort." Immediately following the session, at approximately 3 p.m., the mayor imposed a citywide curfew. Funny One Hans and his companions walked home after the 90-minute Good Neighbor session. Later, he recalled that the city's streets were totally desolated. Hans said that Castle Street resembled a combat zone, complete with jeep patrolling soldiers and ransacked buildings. It was on the same street, according to Hans, that he received the shock of his life. This white grocer jumped from behind his damaged business and pointed a big Colt .45 in our faces. It was one of the biggest guns I have ever seen. What was so scary was that he was shaking and crying. He stated, "You N-words burned up my life saving. I'm going to kill you." At this point, Hans said, as suddenly as the grocer appeared, so did two National Guardsmen. They disarmed the white man, he said, and saw them safely home. "The best thing they ever done," he laughed. At approximately 7:30 p.m. that Sunday night, Smith's Grocery on the corner of South 9th and Orange Streets was firebombed and looted. A short time later, two other white-owned businesses, Parker's Food Store on the north side and Mike's Grocery on South 6th and Ann Streets, received major and minor fire damages, respectively. At 10 p.m., police reported that they had addressed more than 100 people, mostly black, since Saturday night for curfew violations, disorderly conduct, and inciting a riot. Chief Williamson also announced that the 750 National Guardsmen patrolling the city were equipped to shoot looters and arsonists on sight. That Sunday night, recalled Reverend Kojo Natambu, helicopters were flying all around. White folks were going up and down Dawson Street in their paddy wagons, telling people to get off the streets. So, we decided to have a party in our backyard. A helicopter flew overhead and shined its spotlight on us. They tried to make us leave our own yard. The pigs, police, came around and we told them that the curfew didn't say nothing about our yard. When the officers threatened to arrest them for disturbing the peace, Natambu said they relented and went inside. Therefore, he said, an arrest was avoided. But, he insisted, they made their point. They would not be intimidated by the police. Actually, there was nothing happening, he added. They just wanted to show us their force. The following Monday morning, just before school opened, New Hanover County school officials announced that classes were suspended until Tuesday, April 15th. Shortly afterward, Mayor Alsbrook issued an appeal to the rioters to cease their activities and ordered a 6 p.m. curfew. That night, around 7 p.m., a National Guardsman suffered a head laceration when he was struck by a bottle on the corner of South 9th and Dawson Street. At midnight, police reported that during the night there had been sporadic incidents of rock throwing, bottle throwing, and sniping in the vicinity of Gervais Projects, South 8th and Dawson Streets, and Taylor Holmes Projects, North 5th and Nixon Streets, and that rioters had inflicted heavy damage to the North 17th Shopping Center on Market Street Road. At the same press conference, Chief Williamson also announced that there had been 59 arrests from Sunday night to Monday night for curfew violations, disorderly conduct, carrying a deadly weapon, and damage to property. But Williamson insisted the city was returning to normalcy. He emphasized that the violence was basically the work of children and appealed to the black adult community for help. That Tuesday morning, hours before Dr. Martin Luther King's nationally televised funeral in Atlanta, Mayor Alsbrook reimposed his citywide 6 p.m. curfew. Most of the local black adult citizens welcomed the mayor's move. They viewed the violence as counterproductive and disrespectful to Dr. King. Some of them called the rioters hoodlums. Thus, they were relieved later on that night when the local television station's 11 o'clock news program brought doubly good tidings. The city had experienced a sharp reduction in riot-related crimes, and, the best news of all, the heavy rains would last all night long. Early the next morning, Mayor Alsbrook lifted the curfew and officially ended the Wilmington Martin Luther King Jr. riot of April 6 to 10, 1968. At a mid-morning press conference, city officials gathered to listen to the tragic totals. Chief Williamson reported that since Thursday, April 4th, there had been 198 arrests for curfew violations, inciting a riot, carrying a dangerous weapon, and disorderly conduct. Williamson also said that the suspects ranged from ages 13 to 63. 10 were juveniles. New Hanover Memorial Hospital officials confirmed that there were 21 riot-related injuries and no deaths. The Wilmington Fire Department reported 69 firearms, of which 31 were false. Finally, local insurance adjusters estimated damage at $200,000, excluding automobiles. The Wilmington Martin Luther King Jr. riot of April 6 to 10, 1968, was called the worst riot in the state. Why it was the worst is best answered by its black participants. It was the worst because they wanted it to be. They wanted the public to know that they were tired of being at the bottom of their city's ladder and that they considered themselves part of a new black breed who, unlike their ancestors of 1898, were not afraid to retaliate. But most of all, they wanted white Wilmingtonians to know it. Apparently, some whites did not understand them because 5 months later, local white school officials closed the all-black Williston Senior High School. This move, of course, intensified local black discontent and led to more black retaliation. Consequently, the most unfortunate result of the Wilmington Martin Luther King Jr. riot of April 6 to 10, 1968, was the model it set for some local school-aged blacks. As far as they were concerned, it was just the beginning. Chapter 3. Following is a description of the racial violence that followed the closing of Williston Senior High School, which includes the accounts of some former black New Hanover High School and Hoggard High School students who were involved in that violence. This passage also concludes that study of racial violence in Wilmington, North Carolina prior to February 1st, 1971, with a short biographical sketch of civil rights leader Benjamin Franklin Chavez Jr., which ends with his arrival in the port city on February 1st, 1971. Williston Senior High School students officially learned of their school's closing about 2 weeks before the start of the 1968-69 school year. Most, of course, were disappointed because they would be unable to graduate from Williston and continue what some considered a family tradition. But many of them realized there was very little they could do about it. That school year, some of them attempted to adapt to the predominantly white environments of New Hanover High and John T. Hoggard High schools. The majority of them, however, participated in benign protests, such as refusing to partake in school activities and athletics. There was also a small group of black students who openly protested being in what they called unequal setting. Most of them were involved in violent confrontation with whites from the very beginning. School officials quickly labeled them troublemakers and generally suspended them whenever a conflict arose. All that year, officials noted a steady increase in such suspensions, especially at the suburban Hoggard High School. The movement wasn't as active at New Hanover as it was at Hoggard, recalled a former New Hanover High School student, Daniel Banks, a pseudonym. There was more solidarity out there because most of them were from Gervais and Hillcrest projects. However, Banks said he was one of the few at New Hanover who did. He seemed extremely pleased as he recalled his numerous fights with white boys. I listened intently as he spoke of one white whose parents threatened to sue him because he struck their son in the back while he had on a back brace. Banks laughed and implied that violence was the only thing whites understood. But I learned something, he said. There was no smile on his reddish-brown face anymore. He paused to stroke his straggly beard. I learned that if you slap a cracker beside his head 2 or 3 times the next day you see him, that cracker will treat you like a man. But if you sit there and say, "Yes, boss," he'll use you. But if you slap him, you let him know that you're a man. Banks also criticized his fellow contented black schoolmates. He insisted that most of them were scared to fight back that first year because they were on foreign soil. But according to Banks, things began to change that summer as black students gathered at local ballparks and benches. Many of them expressed dissatisfaction with the preceding school year. Most were disturbed because neither school had enough black varsity cheerleaders or black student representatives. Finally, Banks insisted, nearly all of them called for some type of protest in the fall. For some black Wilmington high school students, that following school year, 1969-70, brought more of the same. Violent confrontations with white students, increasing black student suspensions, and no more black cheerleaders. We had almost daily mini-riots in 70, insisted former New Hanover High School student Barnabas Johnson, a pseudonym. One day, he recalled, a white male student arrived on campus brandishing a shark spear gun. He started pointing it at black people because the black beat him up the day before. All they, school officials, did was make him take the gun home. If a black would have done that, they would have suspended him, he added. Sometimes, he continued, whites would start fights and say things like, "What are you N-words up to today?" Almost every time, we ended up chasing them down and kicking their asses. We called them search and destroy missions, he explained. On May 7th of that year, after a search and destroy mission at New Hanover High School, a full-scale riot erupted on both high school campuses. The Wilmington incident of May 7, 1970, resulted in the arrest of over 20 black and white high school students for inciting a riot, disorderly conduct, and disturbing the peace. It began when disgruntled black students at both New Hanover and Hoggard stormed out of their respective gymnasiums because they disagreed with student election results. Nearly all were dissatisfied with what they called disproportionate representation. At Hoggard, a shouting match, with blacks on one side of the gym and whites on the other, occurred. Almost immediately afterwards, fistfights between the two groups developed. Finally, the sheriff's department was called to the scene to quell the disturbance and to haul away persons they considered instigators. Meanwhile, groups of black Hoggard students left campus. Some of them drove across town to New Hanover High School to investigate their disturbances. One such student, Roderick Kirby, Reverend Koja Natambu, was on his way downtown when he became involved in a fracas with a white female parent. The woman, who was on campus to pick up her daughter, accused him of purposely damaging her rear car bumper in an intersection directly in front of the school. She cursed and slapped him after he got out of his car to inquire about the incident. According to witnesses, Kirby retaliated with the fury of punches that nearly rendered her unconscious. Police officers who were already on campus subdued Kirby after a struggle that ended with his arrest for assault on a female and resisting arrest. This incident ignited further violence and culminated with more student arrests. Shortly afterwards, school officials dismissed classes for a few days to allow tempers to cool. Ultimately, for the rest of that school term, law enforcement officers became permanent fixtures on both campuses. That following summer, the students began to organize themselves more effectively, recalled Reverend Koja Natambu. By the fall of 1970, they were ready. One such student, Daniel Banks, remembered how ready he was. I marched all the way to Raleigh with Golden Franks one time, he explained. Banks said that Franks, a middle-aged Eastern North Carolina civil rights activist, was in Wilmington that fall to organize the city's black high school students. We collected over $5,000 for a black co-op he was going to set up. When we marched to Raleigh, I knew the son of a B-word didn't spend $500. We ain't seen him since. After that, everybody was disillusioned, he added. Meanwhile, all that fall, there was a constant fighting between black and white students at both schools. Classes were suspended early, time and time again. Almost daily, white and black parents rushed to the schools to pick up their children. There were also reports that non-students participated in many of the schoolyard brawls, and that in most instances, they were the ones who instigated the violence. Caught in the middle was the majority of the city's high school students who, at this point, began to have weekly rap sessions in the school's library. All of them agreed that the violence was senseless and unnecessary, but most disagreed on the solution. Blacks wanted a radical change in their school's policies, while whites favored a gradual and less dramatic one. Thus, out of this group, black moderates evolved student activists. Weeks before Thanksgiving, a group of black Hoggard students staged a sit-in on the school grounds to protest what they called unequal student and cheerleader representation. They were quickly hauled away by law enforcement officers. Shortly after the Hoggard incident, New Hanover High School students performed a similar act. Once again, police officers interrupted the protest without incident. Some 2 months later, on December 18th, a mini-riot occurred at both of the city's high schools. At New Hanover High, police arrested 17 black students and non-students for loitering, disturbing the peace, and resisting arrest. After the racial violence at Hoggard High ceased, the school's principal, C.D. Gerganos, expelled 11, mostly black, students for fighting. Both of these incidents left the black student community in total outrage. Most were disturbed that only blacks were singled out as troublemakers, while a few whites were reprimanded. It was at this point, the day before Christmas vacation began, that student leaders at both schools decided to boycott classes. Over the holidays, a small student coalition, partially composed of suspended students, was formed to map out strategy for an effective January boycott. Patricia Rhodes, a local anti-poverty worker and a Hoggard graduate, and Mrs. Molly Hicks, a local civil rights activist, were instrumental in bringing together such student spokesmen as New Hanover's Benjamin Watts, Hoggard's William Joe Wright Jr., and suspended Hoggard students Marvin Chili Patrick and Connie Tyndall. The group drew up a tentative list of grievances, which included the reinstatement of suspended students, the creation of Black Studies programs at the local high schools, and permission from the Board of Education to have special citywide program to commemorate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday on January 15th. However, the group's primary purpose at this time was to convince not only the local black students' population of the necessity for a class boycott, but their parents as well. Most black Wilmington parents were unaware of the student boycott. Those who did know about it fell into two categories. There was a minority, the obvious supporters whose children were suspended. The majority, however, was totally opposed to the idea because they were certain that it would solve nothing and ultimately lead to more schoolyard violence. This group considered the Christmas vacation a cooling-off period and was positive that when school reopened on January 4th, peace would prevail. Thus, when school resumed that Monday morning, The majority of the city's black high school students, most of them dressed in their new Christmas clothes, arrived at school as if the preceding 3 years of racial strife never really happened. 11 days later, on the 42nd anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, 15 black Hoggard students staged a sit-in on the school grounds to protest the school board's denial of a memorial service for the slain civil rights leader and to voice their disapproval of Hoggard's suspension policy. Principal Gerganus immediately suspended them. The next Friday, January 22nd, the first mini-riot of the new year broke out at New Hanover High School. This time, Barbara Swain, a black student, was cut seriously when she was hit by a bottle during a fight with a white male student. The following school day, after New Hanover High's principal, John Scott, suspended Miss Swain and chose not to do the same to the white student, schoolyard violence erupted. That following Wednesday, after 2 days of racial fighting, New Hanover County School Superintendent Dr. Haywood Bellamy appealed to the city government for help. Almost immediately, Police Chief Williamson ordered extra men stationed at the two city high schools. On the afternoon of the Swain incident, recalled Reverend Eugene Templeton, then a local white minister of the all-black Gregory Congregational Church, a group of students, the Coalition, decided to start an alternative school. They went over to the 4th Street Neighborhood Center, but the anti-poverty program directors decided they could not use that building. So they went to several black ministers in the community who told them that they thought the idea was ridiculous. Finally, they asked me could they set it up at my church. They said that people were really angry about what was happening. They wanted to set up an alternative school until the Board of Education would acquiesce to some of their demands. That made a lot of sense to me, he added. The 33-year-old 1969 graduate of the Union Theological Seminary said that after he obtained approval from his Board of Trustees, he allowed about 40 students into his church that Thursday morning. That Thursday afternoon, January 28th, at a Gregory Congregational Church press conference, Benjamin Wantz officially announced a black student class boycott of the city's school system. He also said that they were prepared to stay out of school until the local school board agreed to the following 8 demands: the immediate reinstatement of suspended and expelled black students, an end to harassment of black students by police on campus, a cessation of allowing non-students on campus, an end to attacks by male faculty members upon black students, more Afro-American studies, permission to invite speakers, additional academic personnel in the city's public schools, and finally, a school holiday in honor of the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. That next morning, the Student Boycott Leadership Coalition received a negative reply from Dr. Bellamy. He also advised all students in good standing to return to classes or they faced possible suspension. The following Saturday morning, over 100 black students attended school at Gregory Congregational Church. According to Reverend Templeton, since that past Thursday, he and some other blacks, such as Patricia Rhodes, conducted black history classes in the mornings and held strategy sessions in the evenings. He also said that, since then, the group's population more than doubled. It was at this point, he said, that he telephoned the Reverend Leon White of Raleigh, North Carolina, the black director of the North Carolina-Virginia Commission for Racial Justice of the United Church of Christ, for some support. Reverend White's organization was a branch of Gregory's religious denomination specifically created to organize such protests. In fact, White's group was well known for its previous successes in other North Carolina high school boycotts. Besides, insisted Templeton, he considered it inappropriate for him to assume a leadership role because he was white. Reverend White agreed and informed him that he would dispatch his most experienced field organizer, Benjamin Franklin Chavez Jr. of Oxford, North Carolina, to the port city as soon as possible. Shortly after midnight that Monday morning, February 1st, 1971, 23-year-old Ben Chavez wheeled his Eduardo Cadillac into Wilmington, North Carolina, to organize his 5th high school boycott in as many months. In retrospect, insisted former boycotter Barnabas Johnson, Chavez's rival was positive, because before he came, we were unorganized. Besides, the local so-called black leadership wasn't doing anything except criticizing the boycott. Chavez unified us, he said. At that time, nearly all of the black students agreed with Johnson's analysis, especially the females, most of whom called him cute. The N-word was good-looking, recalled one former female boycotter, and could rap good. So, all the women joined the boycott. Once they were in, the men automatically followed, she added. She was right, of course, because the day after Ben Chavez came to town, the boycotters' membership skyrocketed from 100 male-dominated participants to nearly 500 boys and girls. Chapter 4. In 1963, 8 years prior to his arrival in Wilmington, 15-year-old Ben Chavez led his first civil rights protest when he and a small group of followers marched into Oxford's public library. "I ain't seen no sign saying it was all white," he recalled, "so I persuaded some dudes to go with me. I went to the head librarian and said, 'I'm a tax-paying student. I want a library card.' After a short delay, he said, the librarian reluctantly gave them all library cards. A week later, Ben and his group decided to sit in the white-only section of the local movie house. Almost immediately, they were threatened with arrest if they did not leave the area, but the group refused to move. Finally, the theater's operators relented and permitted them to stay. Once again, under Ben's leadership, another Oxford establishment was desegregated. Hence, at an early age, Ben Chavez displayed strong leadership qualities. But that seemed only natural. After all, he was a direct descendant of John Chavez. During slavery, Ben's great-great-great-grandfather, Reverend John Chavez, was a nationally known North Carolina Presbyterian minister and educator. According to the late black historian W.E.B. Du Bois, Reverend Chavez was a Princeton University-educated free black whose English was remarkably pure. His manner was impressive and his explanations clear and concise. During his lifetime, Ben's forefather taught white children by day and blacks at night. Some of his ex-white pupils included a United States Senator, 2 sons of a Supreme Court Justice, and former North Carolina Governor Charles Manley. Black historian John Hope Franklin called him the most prominent free Negro in North Carolina. So distinguished was John Chavez that a street, a housing development, and a city park in his hometown of Raleigh, North Carolina, were named in his honor. No doubt, during his brotherless childhood, young Ben was constantly reminded of his ancestors' achievements. There was also very little question, upon his graduation from Mary Potter High School in 1965, that he would be anything but an educator. The only question was where he would attend college. After a little deliberation, Ben chose his father's alma mater, the small, all-black Episcopalian St. Augustine's College in Raleigh. A month after his enrollment, however, tragedy struck the family when Ben Sr. died. His death caused Ben to study harder. After 1 semester, the chemistry major made the dean's list and was elected sophomore class president. But over the Christmas holidays, a disillusioned Ben Chavez dropped out of St. Augustine's and left home in January to live in Charlotte with his schoolteacher sister, June. That next fall, Ben was one of the first 8 black students to enroll at the predominantly white University of North Carolina at Charlotte. The UNCC experience was a novel one for him because it marked the first time Chavez shared a classroom with whites. Initially, he went through a period of withdrawal, but gradually he began to speak out on the issues that interested him, such as the Vietnam War and civil rights. Within a year, he was chosen head of a local anti-war organization, Students for Action. Later, he was elected UNCC Student Union President and head of the Black Student Union. But after January 1968, it was his work in the Charlotte community with such local black activists as poet Thomas James Reddy, Charles Parker, Vietnam veteran Theodore Alfred Hood, ex-Marine Walter David Washington, and chemistry professor Dr. James Grant, a VISTA volunteer and a draft counselor with the American Friends Service Committee, that took up most of his time. It was also at this point that Ben and his associates, who by then had created the Black Cultural Association, gained the attention of the Charlotte Police Department and local federal agents. The authorities considered the group subversive and blamed them for several Charlotte area bombing incidents. They were also disturbed that the BCA's headquarters, the Black House, was fast becoming the Dope House. These 2 items, plus the fact that their membership grew, prompted police to impose a 24-hour surveillance of the Black House and most of its members, especially the talkative, reddish-brown complexioned Benjamin Franklin Chavez Jr. Later that year, Chavez and Dr. Grant led successful demonstrations at the administration buildings of both UNCC and Belmont Abbey College in nearby Belmont. At both institutions, black students demanded and received agreements to install black studies departments, more black faculty members, and recruitment programs for additional black students. Shortly afterwards, with the dissolution of the BCA, Ben joined the Black Panther organization, a local group similar to the Black Panther Party of California. It was along with this political group and a local organization called the Black Political Organization that Chavez ran in an unsuccessful race for city councilman in 1969. During that time, a busy Ben, along with Dr. Grant, was also a labor organizer with the AFL-CIO and Southern Christian Leadership Conference organizer. It was during his SCLS stint that Chavez led two gigantic marches, one along with Dr. Grant and another with the SCLS statewide coordinator Golden Franks. Both were staged as clemency appeals for two blacks who were convicted of murder, Robert Roseborough and Marie Hill. Finally, in the late fall of that year, during his last semester at UNCC, Ben and Dr. Grant were involved in a successful American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees garbage strike against Charlotte's city government. In 1969, Chavez was also arrested for trespassing when he attempted to give a speech at Charlotte's all-black Second Ward High School. He had gone there at the request of a group of students who were angry because their school would be discounted at the end of the school term. After his arrest, a campus riot almost erupted. Calm was restored, however, after reinforcements were called to the scene. A few weeks after his jail release, Chavez was arrested 2 more times for trespassing. During that time, law enforcement agents also raided his residence several times, looking for suspects. It was at this point that Chavez left the Queen City for his native Oxford. The following new year, Ben Chavez was employed as a substitute teacher in the Oxford school system. Initially, he sought a permanent job at his alma mater, Mary Potter High School, but he was informed that all of the vacancies there were filled. Besides, school officials pointed out, this was the institution's last year as a senior high school. This news did not sit well with Chavez, nor any of the town's young black citizens. Officially, however, there was very little protest. Instead, young black Oxfordians directed their discontent in another direction, recreational facilities. Shortly after his arrival, Chavez organized the Granville County Steering Committee for Black Progress. The group, basically composed of school-aged blacks, presented a list of recreational requests, such as for neighborhood playgrounds and swimming pools. Almost immediately, the town's council, citing poor financial resources, unanimously rejected their requests. 5 months later, one of Chavez's former classmates, Vietnam veteran Henry Marrow, was killed by a young local white male, Larry Teal. The incident began when Robert Teal, a local merchant and Klan leader, fired shotgun pellets into a group of about 20 young, fleeing blacks because one of them whistled at his wife. Some witnesses later claimed that Marrow was killed as he lay on the ground, wounded by Robert's son, Larry. The next day, after neither Teal was arrested, Chavez and about 450 black students marched on the town's courthouse. During the march, law enforcement officials announced that the Teals had been arrested and were being detained in Raleigh for safekeeping. Later that night, in an open field near the Soul Kitchen, a restaurant operated by the Chavez family, several hundred blacks assembled to plan a march. Early that following morning, Ben Chavez led his first Oxford march. But this time, not only were school-aged blacks involved, but, according to Chavez, among the hundreds were older, mature, and concerned blacks. Thus, within months after his arrival, Ben Chavez was deeply involved in one of his favorite pastimes, organizing. Weeks after the march on the Oxford courthouse, Ben Chavez organized a 3-day memorial march from Oxford to Raleigh for Henry Marrow. On the steps of the state capitol, Chavez pleaded for a conference with Governor Robert Scott. That night, after the governor denied his request, arsonists caused millions of dollars worth of damage to some of Oxford's tobacco-filled warehouses. Town officials immediately placed the town under curfew. Finally, 10 days later, calm was restored. Local authorities, however, were infuriated. The tobacco, however, was not locally owned. It had been purchased by the U.S. government. It was probably at this point that federal agents stepped up their surveillance of Ben Chavez. No doubt, they considered him dangerous. After all, they could tolerate marches and rallies, but the destruction of government property, never. Shortly after the Oxford incident of May 1970, the Teals were acquitted of their first-degree murder by an all-white jury. Ben's reaction was to organize an effective boycott of the town's business district. This protest, however, was not only in response to the acquittal, but was staged, according to Chavez, because there were no black employees in any of the district's white-owned stores. Within weeks, some local white merchants complied with the boycott's leader's wish and hired black salespersons. Thus, Chavez scored another victory, and to celebrate, he organized a gala affair attended by hundreds of young blacks on August 22, 1970. He called it Black Solidarity Day. That following fall, Chavez was employed as a field organizer by the Reverend Leon White of the Commission of Racial Justice of the United Church of Christ. The Reverend White, pastor of the Oak Level United Church of Christ in nearby Henderson, called upon Chavez because he was impressed with his previous successes, especially in the area of school disputes. Ben was busy that entire fall. First, that September, he mounted successful marches and boycotts in Nutsbush and Henderson. Again, the issues were school-related. Both were resolved after school officials consented to the young organizers' demands. There were also more violence. In Henderson, a riot occurred, leaving 2 people dead and a tobacco-filled warehouse in flames. Then, later on that fall, Chavez organized student boycotts and marches in Warren, Elizabethtown, and East Arcadia. These efforts, however, were unsuccessful and served to increase the existing violence. In East Arcadia, for example, classes were suspended several times because of the schoolyard violence and bomb threats. Thus, it was probably in East Arcadia, about 20 miles north of Wilmington, during the fall of 1970, that Chavez first heard of Wilmington's school disturbances. Some black Wilmingtonians later contended that he visited the port city before February 1st, 1971, but there is little evidence that this is the case. He went to Wilmington, he later recalled, to mobilize the black community behind the students. At that time, he had no way of knowing that this was nearly impossible. Not even the charismatic Chavez, with all of his experience in organizing and protesting, could accomplish such a feat. For he underestimated the intensity of the psychological damage caused by the Wilmington race riot of 1898 and the wide generation gap it left between young and older black Wilmingtonians. Nor was he aware that since the WMLKR of 1968, the gap had widened. His arrival, according to most black Wilmingtonians, meant another 68. They were right, of course, because at that time, to most young black Wilmingtonians, Chavez represented the one man willing and courageous enough to help them show the crackers that they were not scared rabbits and that they were ready, willing, and able for action. Conclusion. I think by now Ben Chavez realizes that he bit off more than he could chew. It is too bad he did not understand that before he came to Wilmington, North Carolina in 1971, Chavez was playing with revolution when he came to Wilmington. There was no way he could have led a group of children who had not been versed in what the revolution was all about. Most of them believed that revolution meant black retaliation. Chavez, on the other hand, knew from previous successes that there were better ways to bring about a change. Yet, almost from the very beginning, he did little to convince them otherwise. Why? Basically, because he was never really in control. In the end, it would be his speeches that would inflame an already explosive situation. Thus, Chavez's main flaw was his failure to realize that his rhetoric would serve as a catalyst for more violence and not, as he had planned, a way to unify the black Wilmington community. But I would be doing Chavez an injustice if I totally blamed him for the 1971 events. He was a victim of circumstance. School violence of the caliber that transpired in Wilmington was inevitable. It was occurring when I was in high school there in 1967. I knew it would be only a matter of time before it became widespread, especially after local school officials closed all all-black Williston Senior High School. But I had no idea it would reach the crucial point it did. I doubt that anybody did. Chavez realized it later. I was really shocked to see people battling like that. At that point, I just didn't understand the depths of the feelings involved. I didn't know how much the history of Wilmington. I had heard something about 1898, but I didn't know it was deeply ingrained as it apparently was. You had some folks that actually thought that, just because the black students marched and because they were having some meetings, they were going to pay back the white people for what happened in 1898. And so to keep the blacks from paying them back, they were going to wipe out the black community again. Perhaps if Ben Chavez had a fuller understanding of Wilmington's history beforehand, there would not have been a Wilmington incident of February 2 to 11, 1971. Perhaps not. But one thing is certain, if he had not come to Wilmington, the world would have never known. So we have a blundering Ben Chavez to thank for the light he has shown on a complex city that epitomizes white racism, because it clearly exposed how violent racist whites could become. Thus, my thesis is that the Wilmington, North Carolina incident of February 2 to 11, 1971, was an example of black retaliation, and that there will probably be more such incidents in the port city until the effect of the Wilmington race riot of November 10, 1898, has been erased from the minds and hearts of its black and white citizens. Lastly, the reader should keep in mind the overall historical importance of black retaliation. Its advocates have not gone away. They are simply in a holding pattern, waiting for the right Messiah or the right moment. In order to prevent this tragic development from ever happening again, certain social, political, and economic changes must come about. They need not be direct changes. They may, in fact, be gradual, but as strong writer Bernard Inker contended, everything must change. History suggests that playing is a universal human process. Everybody must become mature. What kind of world would this be if nobody could learn? Or if there were no children? The world would not move, and that, most of all, is what history does. It moves.